The C-type changed motorsport completely. This was something that was ahead of the time.
Whenever you jump into a racing car, you're into a living prototype. It's in an extreme environment, which is the right place to develop anything.
You know, somehow they were almost unbreakable.
When the Reims sports car race was won by Stirling Moss, driving a disc-braked C-type Jaguar.
On the 29th of June 1952, Stirling Moss was in France, winning the Reims Grand Prix in a Jaguar C-type. This Jaguar C-type. On paper, it looked like many of the wins that the young 22-year-old lad, already known as the Boy Wonder, had already notched up. Averaging almost 100 miles per hour for over 2 hours. By the time he finally took the checkered flag, he had lapped the entire field. But that race was different, because it was won by a car, this car, using disc brakes, and that had never been done before. Stirling was a passionate believer in the disc brake, so much so that the previous month he and legendary Jaguar test driver Norman Dewis had entered the world's most dangerous race, the Mille Miglia, from Brescia in northern Italy to Rome and back, just to prove the concept. And they damn near won it. 60 years later, and now the sole surviving original Mille Miglia crew, we took Stirling and Norman back to Brescia to celebrate that achievement. And this is their extraordinary story.
When sports car racing was resumed after World War II, the sports car designer turned to the use of all-enveloping bodies to cut down drag, and to smaller wheels to reduce unsprung weight. He arrived at the embarrassing position in which air could no longer reach the brakes to cool them, while the smaller wheels imposed a limit on brake size, with a consequent reduction in efficiency. Higher braking efficiency was vital if the full potential of improved performance and suspension was to be realized. See what I mean?
I'm genuinely proud of the fact that for many years of my working life I was with Dunlop, which at the time was a great British firm, and the aircraft division was right up at the forefront of technical development. It was the aircraft division that developed the disc brake, and it was because of that that Jaguar became aware of this new advanced way of stopping a motor car.
When the brake pedal was operated, hydraulic pressure caused the laterally opposed friction pads to move towards one another and press on the faces of the rotating disc.
Disc brakes were a classic example of, I wonder why they didn't think of that before.
It wasn't quite Star Wars, but it was simple. It was simple to look at. It was so logical. You know, you had this disc and it went round, and then calipers came in and slowed the disc down.
We only do it once. It was 1951, about October. He said, we'd like to offer you a job, would you be interested? I said, not really. I said, I'm quite happy at Lee Francis. So I thought, well, I'll just go along and see what it's about. So I went over there, it was at Swallow Road then, the old factory. I went over there and met Haynes. He took me around the experimental shop, and I thought, bloody awful shop this is. I mean, it was a wooden floor and not laid out properly. And he said, your office will be over there, he said. And I looked, and there was just these metal sheets and a bit of plastic on the top for a window. And I looked inside, there was a table and just a couple of chairs, and I thought, Christ, this is terrible. And he said, well, what do you think? I said, no, I'm not really interested. I said, I'm quite happy where I am. He said, well, what would induce you to join it? I said, £2 a month, because it was a monthly staff job. I mean, £2 now, you just laugh, but £2 then, in the 50s, was quite a good increase. I thought, well, he's going to say no, that will give me a chance now to go back. And he just looked up at the ceiling and looked up at the floor, and he said, go on, we'll pay it.
I know Norman pretty well. He's even older than I am, which is quite an achievement. And it was Norman who was the test driver for Jaguar and was therefore responsible for the development of most of their motor cars in those days.
Norman's legendary. He's full of energy today, even in his 90s, and he's one of those characters. You know, do we create them anymore? I think not, actually, because he was there. He's been there, seen it, done it.
Norman Dewis, responsible for so much at Jaguar, the development of the cars, the testing of them, talented driver, as well as being a very good engineer. And it was more than being an engineer, it's the assessment of dynamic motion, that a really good test driver has the qualities that an engineer simply doesn't have. And to interpret the vehicle's behaviour to create a user-friendly, driver-friendly car, which could make a driver look good or feel good in the car. That's what Norman Dewis was about.
When I got to Jaguar, the first project job Haynes gave me, he said, we went into his office and he got the drawings out. He said, we are in the throes of looking at a new type of brake. He said, in connection with Dunlop, and we have got it on an XK 120. They have started running. They think it's good, you know, and it's gone well. I said, so you finished it? He said, almost. I went out in it and put it through my test, and it just failed completely. I lost the brake and everything. So I got the car back, and when I saw Haynes, I said, how can you sign this off? He said, well, I said, it's not working. I said, I've had complete failure. He said, well, how you failed it? I said, well, how many stops did you do from 100 mile an hour? Oh, we didn't do 100 mile an hour. I said, well, bloody hell, you've got to.
The disc brake was a lovely idea that had been tried in aeroplanes. It was actually used very successfully in aeroplanes, and it was an incredibly difficult process because an aeroplane is actually a very simple device when it comes to brakes, because all it has to do is stop once and it doesn't go around corners when it's on the ground. But cars have to use the brakes all the time and they have to go around corners and all these issues.
So that blew the gaff on it. They realised that it was a long way off development. So what I suggested was, I said, look, the C-Type, it's the quickest car you've got. It's the racer. Why not transfer it onto that? Let's develop it on that, because if we can get it to work properly on that, then it'll cover any car across the board. Good idea.
The Jaguar was built on excellence. It was built on innovation.
When disc brakes came along, they must have transformed the cars that they were on. They built speed so quickly, and Therefore, they needed to get rid of that speed. They didn't have barriers, they had trees and houses to slow them down if they crashed. So I'd imagine it was quite a revelation to head out of the pit with a set of brakes that really seemed as if they actually wanted to do the job, rather than somewhere to rest your foot while you're having an accident.
But I mean, they almost abandoned it because it was so difficult to develop and get the concept to work. It was actually tried on a couple of other road cars in America before Jaguar, and they just gave up because it was just too difficult.
The pad material wear rate was high. The discs used to get hot because they were just basically cast iron.
After some years of research, they evolved in 1952 the first disc brake for use on sports racing cars, in which a metal disc attached to the hub of the wheel replaced the metal ring of the plate brake. The disc was straddled by a caliper attached to the axle. The caliper carried 3 pairs of hydraulic cylinders, each containing a piston and pad of friction material.
When you're doing cornering, a little bit of deflection there used to knock the pads right back. So your pedal, when you first applied your pedal, only moved the pad up to the disc. So you had to double pump to get the pressure then to apply it to the disc. So it was fingertip tough towing all the time, doing the test. But eventually, I say, we got to the point where we were now happy, Dunlops were happy, I was happy with the car and the brake. But that's under test conditions. Now, what do we do to put it under the race conditions, or what should be doing? Lyons didn't want it to go to Le Mans, 52 Le Mans. He said, no way, we're not risking Le Mans, because if it complete failure, he said, that present the race. So then we looked at the calendar and we said, right, Mille Miglia, 1,000-mile race, through the streets, up in the mountains, hard on brakes, all the time, brakes, 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 performance. So that's it. We said, right, let's go for the Mille Miglia. Who do we get to drive?
Hello, I'm Stirling Moss.
Stirling Moss was the epitome of what a racing driver should look like. He walked like a racing driver should walk. He talked like a racing driver should.
You see, racing is really mind over matter, not matter over mind. There are 2 types of racing driver, the quick and the dead, and they're usually the same thing.
He presented himself the right way. He was always immaculate. Seemed always to have a pretty girl in his arm. And by the way, he could drive quite well as well.
He is undoubtedly one of the top 3 racing drivers of all time. He is my hero.
He transcended being a racing driver. He became a global icon.
Who do you think you are, Stirling Moss?
If you look at motor racing as a whole, there's nobody who did it like Stirling, ever. And you know, he is the man.
But he was so versatile, and he would do a sports car race, he'd do a saloon car race, and he'd do the Formula 1 race the same weekend.
4 different races at the same meeting at somewhere like Goodwood or Silverstone, and he'd win them all.
But at the same time, he also had this wonderfully human side to it. I mean, he'd still be waving the girls in the crowd and going off and having all kinds of fun with his mates. But when it came to race day, I mean, the man was just utterly focused. And that's why other people saw Stirling turn up in the pits and, you know, they knew that they were beaten before they got in their cars.
No, I had no idea of what the Mille Miglia could be like, because it could only happen in Italy anyway. I mean, the Italians are so mad keen on racing and so on, and they get on the side of the road, and you know, I had never seen anything like that. We're talking about going around the whole of Italy with 5 million or 10 million spectators, people all along the roads and so on and so forth, and to realise that we've got this potential enormous benefit. I mean, to be able to put your foot on the brakes and then not fade out, it was something incredible, particularly on the car of the speed, if you like, of the Jag.
In the racing world, people are always looking for what they call the unfair advantage, the thing that, you know, that you've got that nobody else has got.
Brake fade was the great thing in those days. Suddenly, the disc brake arrived, and nobody had brake fade.
The most important advantage of the disc brake is that the exposed disc is directly cooled by the airstream, even during actual braking, thus eliminating any possibility of fade. In drum brakes, the braking surface is covered and cooling can only take place by heat transfer through the walls of the drum. The small friction area of the disc brake, compared with that of the drum brake, permits a more uniform pressure loading between pads and disc. This has a great advantage over drum brakes, where loadings may vary over the length of the shoe. This, combined with temperature variations in the drum, can cause a reduction in contact area that may result in a mechanical form of fade.
Jaguar, with these newfound disc brakes, could not only brake later, but brake for much, much longer in terms of time, and would go on to the end of the race still with fresh, strong brakes.
Back in those decades, I'd imagine that each fundamental step would put them seconds per lap ahead and minutes at the end of a race ahead of their main rivals, because that was the curve of evolution.
I think it must have been really frustrating for the other drivers. I mean, racing against, say, things like Largo turbos, which really got a tremendous amount of steam, but they were a big hunk of metal to stop. And, you know, the C-type would come along and just outbrake. You say, thanks very much, you piss off.
So we had another meeting and they said, right, Stirling's driving, Norman. You okay for the co-driver? I said, no way.
The 1952 Mille Miglia race saw the start of a long association between Dunlop and Jaguar Cars Limited, when a Jaguar XK120 was entered, fitted with disc brakes.
And then I suddenly thought, well, Stirling's good, I know him, I've known him a long time. And I did consent, I said, all right, but nobody else, I'll only do it with Stirling. And that's how we came in to do the 52mm.
Mille Miglia was probably my most frightening race ever. I would drive it as hard as I could, always trying to push my threshold of fear a bit further away. The C-Type was a pretty fantastic car. I mean, really, aerodynamically, it was good. I mean, it looked good. It was fast. It would stop. It really was such an enormous step forward just over the XK120, if you like. I can't tell you what Jaguar and Dunlop achieved with that thing. I mean, it was absolutely enormous, and the problems we had in developing them were small compared with what we ultimately achieved.
The brakes were perfect. The brakes performed so wonderful. We'd already caught Kling. We passed Kling in the Merc. We passed Caracciola. We'd passed Biandetti in the Ferrari. So we realised we were pushing on quite, but the reason we were in that position was because we were out braking these guys all the time. We were then heading to Florence. We'd got about 123 miles for the finish when we went round this curve, awash with water coming off the side of the hills, the mountains. There was a big rock there. We clouted it, and it broke the two brackets holding the rack and pinion, sheared them off, so we got no steering. So that put us out the race. Now, I got us down as, at that point, third.
I think we were feeling pretty good because we were up to third or second or whatever it was, and it went out, and therefore I'm realising what a tremendous achievement it was to go around that, you know, enormous distance in that car. Yeah. I think I would have felt pretty good, actually.
Do you remember there was an episode where you came into a control and you were going quite fast and there was a competitor car there and you took his door off?
Oh, did I?
Yes.
Oh.
Stirling is practically a voice in the wilderness these days, because Stirling feels, as do I, that there ought still to be an element of danger in motor racing, because that is part of the attraction. That is what the adrenaline gets going in the drivers, the competitors and the spectators.
People think we're crazy. People think, oh, you're nuts, you're a racing driver, you know, you take massive risks. Actually, we're very calculated. Most of the hideous accidents that have happened over the years have not been the driver's error. They've been something mechanical or outside the exterior that's happened that's created the accident. And I think we're very calculated in what we do. I mean, to get me to go and climb up a tree to the top, it's not part of my deal. To jump out of a plane on the end of a parachute isn't exactly what I want to do every day. I'm not a brave, I'm not a lunatic.
I think the end of the Second World War had a dramatic impact on how people went motor racing, and I'm sure death was much more, they were much more accustomed to death. It was part of life. They'd just finished the war. Because why would you jump in a racing car with no seatbelts, surrounded by fuel, and do 200 miles an hour when there are no crash barriers and no safety?
There are many occasions when I've been near or nearer to death, most likely, and haven't thought very much of it.
But one thing you've got to remember, one of the reasons I raced was because it was dangerous. Because danger to me is something exciting, it's something I'm frightened of. Of course I'm frightened of hurting myself, but it gives you a tremendous kick.
Stirling, you've got to remember, lived at a time when it was by no means strange for 4 or 5 drivers to be killed every year. I don't know how many friends and acquaintances Stirling would have lost as a result of deaths in motor racing, a very, very large number.
Even in the 70s, if you look around and see 1 in 7 of them might have died each year. And I imagine then, and I translated that into when I was a Formula 1 driver, looking around the driver's briefing and thinking, how would this be if 1 in 7 of us died?
You're interviewing me now, here in my home in Buckinghamshire. If you go out there, there's a whole bunch of benches, lovely wooden benches, 25 of them. They're all recognising the death of somebody close to me, close enough to Helen and I to call a friend. We counted 57 who had died, but 25 of them, whether it was Jochen Rindt or Francois Sever, whether it's Denny Holm or whether it's Bruce McLaren, whether it's Jim Clark or Graham Hill, whether it's Mike Spence, whether it's Joe Bonnier or Bandini or Scarfiotti or Senna, they're all out there. That was wrong. That had to stop.
I mean, when you're 17, 18 years old, you like to do something, the bravado of youth, you know, and to get into a car and realise that you could get killed made it much more meaningful.
I know Stirling didn't necessarily approve of it, and I agree with Stirling that right now we've got too many run-off areas where if you make an error of judgment, you're not penalised. I don't mean by death, but by time or by an obstacle that wouldn't allow you to keep making mistakes, running off the track and still staying ahead of the car behind. That's not correct. And the modern idiom has created that. So there's not everything right about it, but what was right was that we couldn't continue with the death rate that we were having. That had to stop for the future prosperity of the sport, for the sport to be there.
It seems to be this slightly strange conflict where on the one hand you seem almost to be seeking the danger, but on the other hand you'd never get in a car you knew was unsafe.
Well, I think I really went into motor racing wanting the danger, enjoying the danger, because I mean, if you go round a corner and you get the corner right, and you just come out by the side, and with just a few inches, you get an enormous feeling of achievement. And it's a very personal thing and very, very selfish, because only you get it. But if you go into a corner 1 yard ahead of a bloke and come out 2 yards ahead, you felt like $1 million. It was a fantastic, fantastic thing you'd done.
I don't think really, I'm afraid, that we can understand just what these guys did. We live in such a comfortable, cosseting world. If you think just what Norman did, I mean, before they even got to the Mille Miglia, Norman drove the car from Coventry all the way there. And then they did the event, and as we know, they didn't quite finish it. They very nearly finished it, and they did unbelievably well, better than anybody could possibly imagine. And once they'd repaired the car, he drove it back again. And all the time using this completely unproven concept, which could, I guess, have failed at any time, with potentially catastrophic consequences. But they needed to prove a point.
It was one of these things that, to me, it was one of the most advanced innovations of the automobile car engineering. I was so pleased that I've been part of it in developing it and testing it and developing it. I don't know why I stayed. I was offered a job at Ferrari, I was offered a job at Aston Martin, I still stayed with Jaguar. The only thing was we had a very good little team at Jaguar, probably about 14 people. And Bob Knight, he was the brilliant suspension man. Malcolm Sayre did the shape, design, aerodynamist, brilliant guy. And Wally Hassan on the engines development. And between us, we got on well together and produced all these. And I think that's what kept me there. I mean, it wasn't the money, that was poor. but I say I could have gone to Ferrari, but I don't know, I didn't bother, so I stayed with Jaguar. I did 36 years with them. Caracciola said to me after, when I saw him, not after the Millie, but I saw him when I was over in Germany at the Nürburgring. He was racing there, and he came to me and he said, Norman, he said, I can't believe, he said, in the Mille Miglia, he said, when you passed me, he said, I was braking hard for the corner, he said, and you just went by, still flat. He said, I thought, they'll never get round the corner, they'll never do it. He said, and then suddenly the lights came on, right in the corner, and you'd gone.
In fact, the real significance is not out here on the racetrack, it's out there in the bigger, wider world, where, I mean, you'll never be able to quantify how many lives have been saved by cars that stopped. And really, all those lives that were saved as a result, which probably must add up to millions over time, can be linked directly back to the work that the very, very brave Norman Dewis and Stirling Moss and the boys from Dunlop and Jaguar did in early 1952.
And here's some of the memorabilia which I've kept, Stirling. You know, there's our original. There's our card that we 619, Stirling Moss, Norman Dewis. There's all the controls that we got stamped.
What are these missing? These ones?
No. These are all.
Yeah, no, those are there.
Those are
there.
They're all right.
Oh, they are.
And that was the last one we went through. There.
Florence.
Florence,
yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
And I think there was an Alfa Romeo in front, and you got right up with him, and the bugger wouldn't move over, so you went between him, pushed him out, and I looked back, and he was in a shop window.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he gone up the pavement.
Very nice of him.
But it was after Florence where we had the steering problem. Him and all of them. But that was the handwritten report that I did when we got back, you know. Say what a terrible driver you was. I wouldn't drive with you again.
Last time.
And you were too much looking after the crumpet.
Well, what I feel, boys, I'm so lucky. I've had a fantastic life. I know lovely people. I'm happily married. I've got children, and you know, motor racing is like a drug. And when you get hooked on it, it's difficult to give it up.
And when you think, Stirling, you and I are standing here 60 years later.
Yeah.
Eh? 60 years ago when we drove this. Eh?
Long
it's
time.
unbelievable.
It is. Yeah. It is.